Oh, I had no idea. Yeah. You said your parents' house? Oh, well, when you were dark, I'm nice man.
No, hey, listen, I've been invited to.
That's the guy who was working for us, this one, the movie shark. I knew that. You knew that? I didn't know that. My entire life, and I didn't know that. Oh, I get it. It's there. maybe. You know, when kids will be on, right? Exactly. And he was. He's so wonderful. I was, oh, thank you so much. You're like, oh, please come to me. Okay.
Good evening, good to see you all, and looking forward to getting started here in just a minute.
Yeah. Oh, I bet you were. I just had people requesting Georgia, like 4 or 5.
Okay, glad they're socializing. Where's my bell?
Total time.
No, not.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. We're having a lot of interaction here in the class. That's great. That's the benefit of being in person.
That's a lot of things to talk about. That's John.
That's good. You know, Millie, the time Nazi here. But I know Jeffrey has a lot to share with us tonight, so we want to get started and be mindful of time. And I know that there's some on Zoom. I think I saw Darren in Florida, and let's see, Scott maybe in Toccoa. So welcome everyone. 17 on Zoom, Jeffrey. So there are a lot here. So if you can't be in person, we're glad of Zoom. Jeffrey doesn't like it that much, but I know it's a nice alternative that you can meet and still get a lot no matter. So welcome everyone. I'm Millie Atkinson, and I really don't have any announcements tonight. I know there's a lot going on in this crazy world, so I'm glad that we could be here in person. I had met with my Iranian hairdresser today, and just keep the people in Iran in your prayers. A lot going on there. She has family there, and I'm sure Raj, I know he's given us an update. So anyway, lots going on there. But it's good to see everyone tonight, and we look forward to our lesson. And I've asked Bruce to come up and open us in prayer, and then we will turn it over to Jeffrey.
Is he here?
He is.
Just checking.
First thing you do is unplug all the electronics. And introduce you to everybody else. Would you join me in prayer? Thank you very much, God. Do we just sort of come to you as we always do? I always like to say that we come to you just in awe of your power and majesty and grace, but most of all, Lord, in your love, that you sought to provide a relationship with us to you through Jesus Christ that we can enjoy both here in this world, in places like this class and in our churches and in the general community, but also in eternity. So we thank you for that. We lift our prayers as always for all the families represented here, all the spouses and relatives and children and grandchildren. Hope you will guide their growth and development. We pray for Christians all over the world, Lord, certainly in Iran and places like Nigeria. They're having terrible troubles, but there are plenty of troubles here as well, Lord. Take comfort in the fact that everything is unfolding according to your plan. And we look at the political situation here in America and we think, gosh, there's so many things which seem to be on a knife edge. And we take comfort in the fact that you're in control, and hope that we will have the courage to recognize that. To bless his class, bless Jeffrey, bless him for all the work he does, and we just look forward to hearing the story of the run up to the founding of America from him. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. And now here's Jeffrey.
Okay, well, nice to be here. Good to see you all, and those of you joining us online as well. So very much looking forward to our session. And I want to start out this evening, just take a few minutes. A couple of questions have come in that I wanted to address. And so I converted some of the key points to PowerPoint here. And let me get to that here, and then we'll dive right in. Okay, the first question that comes up, and this is very common in evangelical churches, and that is the issue: was America founded as a Christian nation, a quote Christian nation? And many people have been taught that, oh yes, of course it was. But of course, the devil's in the meaning of the words. And what does that mean to be a Christian nation? And and what are the implications of that as well? So I've written before, and especially in my book, American Crisis, America was not founded as a Christian nation, but it was founded as a Christian influenced nation. Big difference, by the way. I remember years ago reading this book by R.C. Sproul, Life Views, and R.C. Sproul had written in that book, America was not founded as a Christian nation, but it was founded as a theistic nation. Well, that's generally true, although some of the most influential of the founding fathers were not theists, they were deists, Franklin and Jefferson, and there were a couple of others. Most of them, of course, were theists, but not all of them. But
What do you mean by theist? What define theist?
oh, theism is the idea that there is a creator, eternal God, who is responsible for all that exists. Now, we talk about Christian theism, biblical theism, because there's also, Islam is theistic in a sense,
But there's no.
and there's others as well.
In a theist, there's no Jesus Christ.
Not necessarily. Yeah,
But
not
you're
necessarily.
saying-
So Christian theism would recognize the Trinity, which of course
Okay.
Jews do not, and also the deity of Jesus Christ and his incarnation and miracles and atoning death and resurrection and so on. So that would be basically the defining features of Christian theism. And so I'll just, when I'm using that term theism, that's what I'll be implying. But yeah, there are some other variations on theism. Deism is the idea that there is a universal, eternal creator God, but this is a God who has not been involved in human affairs. He created the laws of nature, and they'll also concede that we are created in the image of God. So the bottom line is, according to their logic, is we don't really need his intervention and direct involvement in our lives. We were created in his image with a rational mind, with moral sensibilities, and so on. And so that really eliminates the need for prayer, for instance, because he's more like, you might say, an absentee landlord. Okay, he owns all this stuff, but you rarely, if ever, see him. And frankly, you don't need him. So that's more deism. And that would characterize people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and
Well,
folks
I
like that.
think the Bible, where does the Bible stand in? What's the Bible standing in a theist? If I'm a theist,
Mhm.
do I read the Bible?
Oh, yeah. Well, if you're a Christian theist,
Okay.
yes. Yeah, if you're a Christian theist, you would. And because the Bible is not only the greatest work on theology, but also the greatest work on philosophy as well. So we believe it was divinely inspired and absolutely essential, for living a life that's pleasing to God. Okay.
Hey, Jeffrey,
Yes.
what is the difference between a deist and a theist? I don't quite see the difference.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sort of a bottom line issue would be that a deist does not believe that God is involved in human affairs on a day-to-day personal level. And so he created the universe as it is, including the laws of nature, so that the universe is functioning in such a way that we can have even, the evolution of science, for instance, our understanding of how the world operates. But we are made in God's image according to the deists, and therefore we're endowed with a rational mind, with a moral conscience, with a sense of creativity, and so on. And so many would say, in fact, this would be common for deists and Unitarians and Universalists, actually, and that is that there is no need for prayer, that God has given us everything we need to live a quality life that's pleasing to him. Okay, does that make sense, Kit?
So no need for a savior.
No need for a savior. And that's why deism kind of morphed eventually into both Unitarianism and Universalism. And then those two religions fused by the latter half of the 19th century. And so now we have, I think there's one or two here in Cobb County, if I remember correctly. You have these UU churches, Unitarian Universalist churches. Okay. and they came out of the deist movement. Yeah. Bruce?
Just, of course, in the founding era, these were not tightly drawn distinctions. And in fact, you get the feeling like, depending on where the social winds were blowing, whether someone was more deist or more theist. The famous example was Benjamin Franklin, who by all accounts was a deist, who called for prayer in the Continental Congress.
Yes.
In a period of great, difficulty.
Yes.
That was unusual. To whom and under what basis?
Yeah. Why are you praying to God for his,
Assistance or
what's that?
for his assistance.
Yeah, his assistance and so on. I mean, we're made in his image. We just need to follow our best inclinations. And by the way, I was talking to somebody, yesterday, in fact, and he mentioned that very thing. That when I was talking about the deism of Benjamin Franklin, he said, "Well, Benjamin Franklin, at the Continental Congress, after a few weeks in which they weren't accomplishing anything much, he got up and he said, we need to pray, and ask for divine involvement." Well, do you know the rest of the story? Anybody know it? Well, his resolution didn't pass. And the reason was, two things. One was, again, some of those who were present said, well, we don't really need to do that. Plus, if we bring in a Presbyterian to pray, then it's going to offend whoever else, Baptists or Congregationalists, whatever. And so, and the other thing was that, we don't really need it in the first place. And so nobody seconded his motion. And so it died, basically. Oh, the other issue was somebody said, well, there is no money in the budget to pay a minister to come in and pray, as if you had to have a professional minister to come in and pray. So that was the other issue that killed Benjamin Franklin's proposal and all. Oh my.
What was one of the first reasons?
Pardon me?
What was one of the first reasons they killed him?
One of the first reasons why nobody moved on that proposal
Yeah.
was the idea that it was a diverse group of people, and they some thought that it would be offensive if they called in a congregational pastor, or it might offend some others, and some thought, well, if we call in an Anglican pastor, that would offend other people. And then there was the issue, well, we don't have any money to pay somebody to come in and pray. So Franklin's proposal went nowhere. Yes, Dan?
Well, very briefly, I was raised
Okay.
in the, and so I take note when I drive by one of their congregational buildings. Anyway, the one on Canton Road above between Marietta and Woodstock.
Yes, I've been there
They keep
before.
a large variation of the familiar yard sign outside, and their version, I have a picture of it I took. In this congregation, we believe love is love, Black Lives Matter, climate change is real, no human being is illegal, all genders are holy and good, women have agency over their bodies.
Good.
So they tend to attract people of a certain persuasion,
You might say.
ideologically in addition to theological.
Absolutely. Was that just relatively recent that you saw that sign? Because I saw it, 7, 8 years ago.
Well, they have it. The wind blows it down and they put it back. It stays a permanent.
Okay.
It's a permanent thing.
All right.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. Yeah, there are a couple of UU churches here in Cobb County and North Atlanta. I remember taking some students to a Unitarian Universalist church one Sunday morning so they could experience it. And the most perceptive question that one of these students asked me was, who are these people praying to anyway? I mean, because they do have people get up and pray, but to whom? And so I said, well, that's an excellent question. You know, who are they praying to? I guess just the grand spirit of the universe or something like that. Yes, Philip.
Attended one UU service,
Mhm.
and this is how we started with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, our Mother.
Oh,
Lord in heaven.
well, that's true in a lot of liberal Protestant churches as well. Yeah.
Well, this is simply the most liberal Protestant church, you know, just ahead of the unit, what's called the United Church of Christ, which originally came out of the same movements that created the Baptist Church, but you know, they went further out.
That was liberal congregationalism that became the United Church of Christ. Not to be confused with the, you know, fundamentalist churches of Christ that are common in the South and Midwest.
But the UCC is pretty liberal ideologically as
Oh,
well as
extremely.
yeah. And so one UCC person told me it really should stand for Unitarians considering Christ.
So obviously we were not a Christian nation. Back to the
Back to the point.
subject, yes.
Yeah.
It comes up.
Yeah. Okay, so you'd like to move on to even one more slide, okay? All right, so here's kind of a shorthand response. So we'll go into this in more depth, you know, in subsequent weeks. Was America founded as a Christian nation? Well, in reality, no nation or no empire in history was or ever could be a quote Christian nation or a Christian empire in the true sense. Now, true Christianity is not primarily just a religious institutional affiliation. True Christianity, and a true Christian, as you know, is one who's been spiritually regenerated by the grace and power of God and who's committed to living accordingly. Now, there have been many Western nations since the time of the late Roman Empire that claimed to be Christian. You know, the last 150 years or so of the Roman Empire, it was officially, quote, Christian, as it was just becoming more and more degenerate and falling apart. And eventually it was conquered, of course, by, quote, barbarians. But there have been many Western nations since the time of the late Roman Empire that claim to be, quote, Christian, but only on the basis of having an official state church. Now, you know, for a long time that was Roman Catholic Church, but in Eastern Europe and so on, it could be the Greek Orthodox Church, or years later, centuries later, even the Russian Orthodox Church. Or during the Reformation era, it could be the Lutheran Church or the Presbyterian Church, depending on the area of Europe we're talking about. And so all these nations would claim to be, quote, Christian nations. In fact, even in the early 20th century, before the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Orthodox Church continued to claim that Russia was the most true Christian nation in the world. And of course, it was just utterly corrupt, as I'm sure you know. So the point here is that some nations have been more influenced by Christian beliefs and values than others have. And in this regard, I think the United States has been truly unique. However, the US Constitution does not mention God. It does not mention Jesus Christ. It does not mention the Bible. It does not mention American Christian heritage or anything like that. The only references would be in Article 6, Section 3, which bans any religious test as a qualification for office. And then otherwise, it only mentions God in the epilogue in the year of our Lord, 1787. Okay, those are the only mentions. Okay, move on here. As I said, there's some nations have been more influenced by Christian beliefs and values. In reality, I think America has been uniquely influenced by biblical Christian values. But again, that's different from calling it a Christian nation. Now, as you know, I mean, our nation I think we all feel so blessed and privileged to be Americans. About 5% perhaps of the people in the world live in this country, so it's a lot to be thankful for. But on the other hand, every conceivable kind of injustice and evil has been prevalent in American history from the very outset. We were the last civilized nation to ban slavery. Even Russia had freed the serfs before America, abolished slavery, for instance. And so we would not want to attribute everything in our past to being a Christian nation. That would be an absolute insult on the Christian faith. But again, we have been uniquely, I think, blessed by God, and Christianity has been a significant influence in American history. Now, as you see there, the U.S. Constitution does not mention God, Jesus Christ, the Bible, or American Christian heritage. Some of America's founders regarded the Constitution, in fact, as a godless document. Now, after the Constitutional Convention, it took many months before all the states ratified it. Well, one reason that some of the anti-federalists were opposed to the Constitution, they said it was a totally godless document. And it didn't fully recognize, the centrality of the Christian faith in our history and all. So in reality, America was founded as the most secular, actually, officially non-religious nation in Western civilization at the time. Virtually all other Western nations had an officially established state church that was funded by the government and also funded, of course, by the taxes from citizens.
Jeffrey, the reason for that, I think one of the key reasons is the word liberty was a primary word in the minds of the writers of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Liberty, and their experience in England was not having liberty of worship and freedom of religion.
That's right.
Had to do with that.
Yes. And some of those that were the most intolerant toward people of other faiths were Protestant Christians. And so again, this is just reality, and it needs to be acknowledged. See, we don't want to fall into the trap of the secularists and leftists of our day and talk about how awful America is and just focus almost exclusively on America's flaws. But on the other hand, we don't want to sanitize American history either. That's not honest, just as the other extreme is not honest. So we have nothing to fear from, just the plain truth. But we need to make it very, very clear that although America has been influenced, it was not in any sense a Christian nation. However, as you see, America was also not founded as a secularistic nation. Now, one that is anti-God or hostile to the Christian faith. Now, as we oftentimes talk about this sort of thing, when you see that suffix on a word, istic or ism, it oftentimes radically changes the root word. So secular is one thing. It's just, not necessarily religious or not necessarily Christian. Secularism, however, is really an anti-God position. And that's certainly where so much of American society and culture has, what it has become in the last century or more. One in which, look at the two political parties, frankly. Now, the Republican Party, of course, has its share of problems, to say the least, but the Democratic Party is just outright secularistic. It's an anti-Christian, anti-God, political party as far as the agenda that they're promoting. And so as flawed as the Republican Party is, it's still quite an alternative to what we find in the Democratic Party. But look here at the Treaty of Tripoli, signed in 1797. Now, this was negotiated by the George Washington administration. It was ratified unanimously by the US Senate, and it was signed into law by Washington's successor, John Adams. And Article 11 of the Treaty of AAA includes a brief description of religion in America. Now, by the way, this is a treaty that was signed with North African Muslims and all. And in that, it stated very clearly that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Okay. Now, that's something you might hear some secularists talk about, in recent times. No, this takes us back to the John Adams administration, just a few years after the founding of the American nation. So the United States, of course, was not founded as an anti-God secularistic nation like France would become a few years later during the French Revolution. I mean, it was implacably not only socialistic, but it was, anti-Christian. So the US was not founded as a secularistic nation, one that was hostile to religion in general and Christianity in particular. But on the other hand, it has influences far beyond just the Christian faith itself.
It
Yes.
strikes me just how important that balance is and how it's nuanced, right? And
It is.
and so many people today just want a soundbite.
You're right.
Either
I mean,
way.
yeah.
And there's the danger, I guess, just and also the tendency that went on as I was studying this. I couldn't believe how earlier than I thought history was being rewritten. It's not just modern times.
You're right. You're right. Well, every historian writes out of a particular worldview and a particular philosophy. So he's going to honestly or dishonestly structure his writing according to his philosophy. Okay? And they may do it with the best of intentions, but still, and that all has to be taken into consideration. I was talking to somebody recently, in fact, just last week, who wanted me to come and speak on America's mixed heritage. And I thought it was real interesting. He made it very clear that he just wasn't interested in the dark side of American history. He just wants, the pure, Christian elements and influences. And I thought, that is so common in our churches. Now, if we were in a real liberal church, it would be just the opposite, wouldn't it? I mean, they just want the dark, seedy side of our history. And but both approaches defy reality, and we need to, we need to operate in the realm of reality. So there's horrible things in our history, and yet on the other side, compared to every other nation that's existed in human history, we're so privileged to be Americans.
We still have the biblical worldview in that, like you just said, we're a nation of sinners. And as such, we do have a lot of bad history as being such a, so that that kind of ties in a little bit. Also, the founding fathers, or some of them at least that I've read, pointed out that since we are a nation of free people, I mean, very free compared to elsewhere, that it's very important that we follow a set of biblical views of morality and virtue.
See,
I should use the word virtue a lot.
Yeah, the great thinkers, the James Madisons and even Jefferson and people like John Adams and so on, they always tied freedom and liberty with virtue. They understood that you have to have both, and both have to be promoted, in a society, or else it's going to just, fragment and
we'll go
dissolve.
back to a dictatorship or a king.
Yeah.
Interesting, what we have now is we have those things in place, the Constitution, what the things in the Declaration said, but we don't have children being trained in virtue.
That's right.
By and large, and so
That's right.
now we have documentation without the people having the ability to lead well.
See, and all through the 20th century, in the education establishment, starting at the elite, universities, Columbia and others like that, it was thought that teaching virtue, well, that's just your opinion, what's virtuous, what's right and wrong. So eventually, what happens is you just totally eradicate any moral-based education, because after all, everything is relative, everything is subjective, and you have no right to, try to prevail your values onto other people.
Parents have done it too.
Yeah, but
That's right.
parents, in fact, family that's being destroyed, it's the ones that were the nexus of values, principles, culture.
Mhm,
It's the way in which they look at life,
mhm.
the way they view life. And so we're all part of our culture and our background as in a family.
That's right.
So it is what we're destroying is the reason why our children now are left on their own to be able to go to universities and schools that then take it from a very secular point of view as opposed to.
But that's okay because we have social media to help them.
Well, yeah, that's right. TikTok is right there at the top.
Yeah. Oh my, what a mess. I mean,
But
I'm sure we're all very much in prayer for, children and grandchildren and all that are growing up in this polluted, perverted
Yes.
culture, society.
Jeffrey, if you wanted to destroy this country, you would destroy the glue. And the glue is a biblical worldview that
That's right.
most of us, I think, try to follow, not perfectly, but because we're so free that glue there is very important. If
Yeah.
we're in a dictatorship, we don't need the glue because the king is the glue.
Yeah. Or the dominant political party.
Yeah.
Yeah, whether it's the communists or the Nazis or whatever the case may be. All right, so I'm sorry for taking so long on this. I'll finish up real briefly here. So was America founded as a Christian nation? Well, we'll come back to that theme, from time to time in our study. But I think we have to have a realistic understanding of this. Otherwise, when we take a very simplistic view, then people tend not to take us seriously. If you want to present a sanitized view of American history, you're going to lose your credibility with people that know, the depths of our history and so on. All right, so that's one question that came up.
They want complexity, they want sound bites. And they are fed sound bites through the media and through other sources. And that's all they want to hear. And then they then internalize that as their direction in life.
Yeah.
That's what they believe.
Yeah.
Sound bites.
Yeah, well put. Yeah. And again, our education system is just so corrupt now.
Exactly.
And so you throw out moral-based education and you can expect, what the result will be. So I think we went over this. America was founded on the principles of religious liberty, the anti-establishment clause of the Constitution, and the separation of church and state in the true sense of the term, by the way. That's a term that's been so polluted and perverted over the last 150 years. But those are the principles on which America was founded, and we should cherish that tradition. All right. Now, another question that came up, somebody asked, what are the fundamental principles on which America was founded, the fundamental principles of good government? And so I thought, well, that's an excellent question. So I'll put a little bit of thought in it. And so I'll rush through this real quickly. Number one, a political system has to align with the realities of human nature. Now, you realize dictatorship does not align with the realities of human nature because it assumes that the populace, the people of a nation or whatever, are so horrible that the government has to dictate and micromanage their lives. However, on the other extreme, you have the libertarian, libertine view, and that is human beings are so good that we need virtually no governmental oversight at all. So you have those two radical extremes, and what you find is the founding fathers understood that there's a middle ground there. We do need the rule of law and so on, but they have to be just laws, and that would allow as much human freedom as possible. So political system must align with the realities of human nature. The reality of the Imago Dei. We've been created in the image of God, and therefore we have a rational mind. We're imbued with a rational mind if we'll use it. We also have a sense of moral consciousness if we'll use it appropriately. We also have been given a gift of creativity and so on, and also all of that is inherent in the reality of having been made in the image of God. Also, however, there is the reality of human sin, egoism, and so on. So humanity is made in the image of God, and so on. But humanity is also flawed. The second principle of good government would be the rule of law. And what I usually do is go back to Samuel Rutherford's classic in the 17th century, Lex Rex. In other words, the law should rule over monarchs or government officials or whatever. And so the implication there was you need a system of just laws. And of course, the British, the English had been developing that since the time of the Magna Carta back in the 1200s. And then it very, very slowly, evolved into the system of later centuries. But what you need are set laws that all political leaders, even if they are kings and queens, have to abide by, or at least they should abide by them. So the supremacy of an objective code of law that should govern all, officials in society. This was basically a rejection of the idea of royal absolutism. If God has given you this position as the king or the queen, then you should rule without any sense that that you have to abide by any higher principles and all. So the rule of law. Number three, constitutional and limited government. And that's something that we easily identify with American history, isn't it? In other words, the government should enact and enforce laws while respecting basic individual liberties. Okay, so constitutional and limited government. Number four, what about those laws, by the way? Well, enact and enforce just laws based on the common principles of natural law. Now, natural law is the lowest common denominator in terms of how of moral thinking and moral behavior that we can and should expect of everybody, regardless of their religion, of their mentality, their station in life or whatever. Now, as Christians, of course, yeah, we believe in natural law. The Apostle Paul talks about it in Romans 1 and 2. And we should abide by those basic moral principles. But as Christians, we're called to a much higher standard, aren't we? In other words, the bottom line of natural law theory is do no evil to other people. Well, that's a great moral truth, isn't it? But there's also a greater moral truth, and that is what Jesus said, love others proactively. Don't just refrain from hurting other people, but actually love them in the true sense and enhance, the quality of their lives. Okay? So as Christians, yes, moral law is very important. C.S. Lewis in his writings referred to it as the Tao, using a Chinese term. And so very important. Now that would include, by the way, respect for the sanctity of human life. That's a part of natural law. That's a good starting point. But again, as Christians, we go above and beyond all that. Okay. So point number 4. Number 5, a good government would provide equal justice and equal opportunity under the law to all of its citizens. Equal justice, equal opportunity, regardless of a citizen's sex or race or ethnicity or their religion. Okay. It took us quite a few generations to finally, make that normative in American society. But another key principle of good government. Number 6 would be protect and defend citizens from all threats, both foreign and domestic. Well, that's a fundamental necessity of government, isn't it? This necessitates the protection of the nation's borders, by the way. And furthermore, immigrants coming into the country should integrate and assimilate into the nation's culture and become proficient in its language and so on. One thing I remember learning actually in high school about Theodore Roosevelt, he despised this idea of what he called hyphenated Americans. Now, back then it was like Italian Americans or Polish Americans or whatever. And he despised that idea. He said, no, if you come here, your responsibility is to integrate as much as possible and assimilate, into the American melting pot, as they called it back then. And I think that's a very, very valid, concept that should have been followed wholeheartedly. So protect and defend citizens from all threats, foreign and domestic, just laws and just penalties for all crimes. Don't let somebody, because of their social status, get away with something that you punish, a common person for. Protection of the nation's sovereign borders. Immigrants should integrate and assimilate into the nation's culture and become proficient in its language. Okay. And then lastly, in terms of 7 principles of good government would balance liberty with personal virtue and civic responsibility. And again, this takes us back to the early founding fathers. They were wholeheartedly in support of this. All laws should have a moral and an ethical foundation in keeping with the principles, again, of natural law. See, now as Christians, we cannot force other people to live by the very highest standards of biblical, moral principles and so on. But we can support basic common laws that require a certain level, of fidelity to those kind of principles and so on. As Christians, again, we're called to a higher level, higher moral level. So 7 principles of good government. So sort of the summa, you might say, of all this would be the line in the Declaration of Independence that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. That very effectively, sums up, I think, many of these principles. Yes, Dan?
Very quickly, a gentleman named Nathan Sheely picks up on that exact thought. And he explains that, as you know, as many of us here will know, that the late Dr. Harry Jaffa took quite an exception to the sort of mob rule or popular sovereignty view of democracy held by John C. Calhoun and others. And obviously the Jacksonians were big on that. And so according to Sheely, Jaffa explained Calhoun's position as being that whatever interest groups can agree upon is presumed to be a rational or just outcome. We're talking about the just powers. But Jaffa says this is just following the form, everybody agreeing, and not the content of what's agreed to. So per Sheely, Jaffa says the Declaration of Independence does not simply say that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. Rather, it limits that consent to the derivation of just powers And Shealy comments, unless this is a quote from Jaffa, my own notes are a little unclear here. But this is the point, unless the governed are enlightened such that they understand a priori before everything else, the distinction between just and unjust powers, consent alone will not make government legitimate. In other words, there are powers that no consent can render just.
That's an elitist point of view. I
Amen.
mean, that's exactly what we're seeing in an elitist bent right now in our own culture. So what you just said was an elitist view.
Yeah, what would be an example of what you're thinking there?
Well,
Transgenderism, you know.
well, you get into whether it's political or you get into the institutions, the universities and all, and they start stating a principle that's contrary to what we're talking about here, because they have a much deeper understanding, given their education, their background and all, and they can then transmit that to the students who then inculcate that in their lives and becomes a part of their ethics and their values. Yeah. So that's an elitist point. The only way that we can govern is through those elitists and not defer to the government, to the governed or the governing group, because they don't have an understanding of that and are capable of that. They're not smart enough. In fact, I was declared an ignorant individual by an elitist.
Well, their status in society.
That's exactly what it is, a PhD and other things.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Well, let me add to the
So,
gentleman.
okay,
That the founding fathers told us over and over again, I think this fits with what you said, that our greatest threat to our liberty is government.
exactly.
that's because they came out of a tradition where every nation just about for thousands of years had had dictator monarchs and so on. So,
well, they were recognizing the natural nature of man, the sinful nature, that you can't trust him with all power, as what Jefferson was talking about, and that the greatest threat to our liberty is more was going to be coming from people like that within the government.
Power corrupts.
Well,
and so does money. And so those two right there are what corrupts the mindsets and the governing rulers.
Well, and in any authoritarian state, the implication is that the people are too ignorant, immoral, or whatever. So we need strong leaders. Well, those strong leaders also have a sin nature, don't they? And we know from history that some of the very worst people in society weasel their way to the top. And so it's a whole self-defeating, mentality there. Bruce, and then we'll move on here.
Just two quick things. One way to think about the current situation where we've raised a generation, maybe several generations of children who are supposedly educated and don't even understand that there are two sides to an issue. Right. They're not even aware, right? So that's one thing, partly because they don't know history, but partly because they've been taught by exactly the kind of people that you're talking about.
And they don't know philosophy, logic.
But the other thing about it is that Scalia famously said that there are many countries which have constitutions which offer much more in the way of stated enumerated rights to their populations, but in those countries you don't really have any rights. And the only thing that guarantees our rights in this country is the separation of powers. So that you set two sides, three sides against each other, and you hopefully will not go down as far down this elitist trend as you might otherwise, with a unitary executive and a one house.
Right. Yeah. Good point. Well, it's about time that we started our session for this evening. And, but these two questions that came up, I thought were worthy of thought and response. Was America founded as a Christian nation? I mean, that's what most people in conservative circles are exposed to, and it needs to be refuted. And what about the 7 fundamental principles of good government? And so I think it was time well spent. But having said that,
can you email the 7 principles?
I could, sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. Yeah. And by the way, this is a work in progress. I just, somebody brought it up, and so I put this together just in the last week or two.
You might have
Um,
used that with others that we discussed this with.
I'm sorry.
Would you give us permission to share this? Or can we share these principles with others?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, just write a check to the,
Just tell me who it is and on the
No.
two line.
No. Yeah, I will. I'll do that. And by the way, if you're interested, if you'll, think about all of this, and if there's anything else that you think needs to be added, let me know. But again, these are just thoughts that came to me in the last couple of weeks or so.
I have.
All right, so.
I think, let me suggest one, a statement of our rights. Where do our rights come from? This, you got that, but we don't, it doesn't say, doesn't make a statement about, where our rights come from. And therefore, the government is going to assume that they're the ones who gave us our rights. They're already trying to do that nowadays, but.
Well, that's a good point. I'll think about that, because again, I was trying to keep it on the natural law level.
That's part of the natural law. What they said is that are God-given rights. Well, that's kind of bringing in a religion though, but that's what it says in the Declaration. Anyway.
Yeah.
Shut up.
No, that's a very good point you bring up. Where do these natural law principles, where do they come from? Well, if you're not a Christian, I guess you would just say that it comes out of your human nature. We know that it's not right to do something or say something about another person that you wouldn't want done or said about yourself. So I think all of humanity, if they think at all, would come up with that conclusion, And so that's about as foundational a level of morality as you could possibly come up with. But you're right. I mean, ultimately, we're made in the image of God, and that's where this ability to think through issues like this come from.
Our rights come from someplace, whether there's a God or not. So it's not stated.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah. That's right.
But this evolved. The book says it was an evolution all the way, and so
the natural law.
The natural law.
Yeah, you can trace it back to pagan Greek philosophers, Plato and Socrates and so on. And yet there's some embedded truths that Christian philosophers and theologians later imply or applied as well. Yeah.
You summarized that quite well.
Thank you. Okay, so the outline. All right. So let's take a look at the outline. It's rather extensive, and obviously we don't have time either tonight or even next week to go through it in any real detail, but there are certain points that I think would be very valuable to emphasize. So if you look there at the first page, at the top it says number 2, early Christian influences in colonial America. There basically were 2 contrasting visions when it came to early American colonization. And so one, you might say, was the Puritan vision of a Christian commonwealth, a new Jerusalem and so on. And we know that more or less was what brought what we call the Pilgrims to America, and later the Puritans and other Christians as well. And so that was a major impulse. But also you had the system that the founding fathers established under the Constitution. And this vision was founded on somewhat different principles of Enlightenment rationalism, classical liberal ideology. Now, by the way, liberalism, that's another one of those terms that we have to define, because it's a man-made term and its meaning has changed greatly over the last 250 years. So what was a classical conservative back in those days?
Weren't the liberals who were in favor of rights for people?
Well, classical conservatism. Well,
In the monarch.
well, yeah, classical conservatism say was all about a rigid class system, a monarchy. Every nation needs a monarchy to keep people in order, and an established state religion, which everybody needed to adhere to, whether you believed it or not. Okay, so those three elements basically define classical conservatism. Now, that has nothing to do with contemporary conservatism or recent conservatism. Classical liberalism was the founding ideas and principles that went into the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, and so on. And it has very little, if anything, to do with how we use the word liberalism today, of course. And so two visions for American colonization, you might say. There were those who were coming here in order to set up a free and pure Christian society in their minds. And then there were others who were coming here just based more on, again, liberal ideas of freedom and so on. And, freedom, well, that's a mixed bag, isn't it? And for some people, it means, the opportunity to live in keeping with God's design for your life and God's principles. And then for other people, liberty and freedom, well, that's the right to do anything you please. Remember going into a record store about 30 years ago, looking through the new releases, and I came across an album called As Nasty as We Want to Be. And it was some rancid group. I can't remember who it was or anything, but it really struck me. It was like, oh, yeah, that is exactly what freedom and liberty mean to people that have no moral, foundation. You can be as nasty as you want to be. Boy, that's real freedom, isn't it? So anyway, having said all of that, let's go into the motives for English colonization, and Allie's going to lead us through.
Donna starts.
Oh, I'm sorry, Donna. Yeah, I was reading down the page there. So Donna is going to start, and then Allie will follow up from there. So Donna, looking forward to it.
Thank you, Jeffrey. All right. Oh. Okay. We're gonna change it up a little bit. We're gonna switch to motivations that are not at all religious or not at all about Christianity. These are the personal and economic reasons or motivations for English colonization. So in the 1600s, more than 500,000 people sailed from England and Europe to America. Most American colonists were lower and middle class commoners because America offered an opportunity to make a better living, hopefully a better life, if they could survive. So it was not an easy change. Now, there were a handful of reasons, and we're just going to go over a few of them today. But one of the first ones, it's called the enclosure movement. And the enclosure movement was a historical shift in England beginning in about the 16th century. And it was where the common lands, which had previously been open for communal use, were privatized, fenced, and consolidated into individually owned and managed farms. Now, this did enable more efficient agriculture, and it also enabled some grazing rights. But what it did is it displaced the rural populations from where they had lived, really, their families for centuries. So the process replaced the medieval open field system with private property, and it did boost agricultural productivity through better crop rotation, and it controlled grazing, but it did force these commoners off the land. So in England, the English enclosure movement led to large-scale dislocation and high unemployment. The English land barons, they planted hedges to fence their estates off for pasture land for raising sheep. And this again was push the squatters and the tenant farmers and squeeze them off into cities and really just, I think, made them destitute. But why were these fencing them off? And this was because of the rising demand for wool and sheep farming. So especially in the 15th and 16th centuries, England's wool and textile industry grew rapidly with a high demand for domestic cloth production and exports. So sheep required large, continuous pastures as opposed to, say, scattered strips and open fields. So the landowners converted what used to be cropland to pasture land, and often forcibly evicting tenants or restricting common rights. So there was a famous quote from Thomas More, in his paper that he wrote in 1516 called Utopia. And he said, "This sheep devoured men." And this was a criticism of how the profitable wool led to this mass displacement. There's a book I'm reading now called Against the Machine by author Paul Kingsnorth. And he quoted in that book an 18th century rector of Cookham, Berkshire. And he said of his local area that an amazing number of people had been reduced from comfortable state of partial independence to the precarious condition of mere hirelings. So it changed their entire way of life to a way that they had never known. So the cities such as London were overcrowded with these unemployed and displaced farmers, and the crime rate increased as many vagrants resorted to begging and robbing and thievery. So again, these enclosures evicted many small farmers, tenants, and commoners from their traditional lands, leading to widespread poverty, unemployment, and rural depopulation. Again, we're creating a surplus of laborers who sought opportunities elsewhere, one of them being to immigrate to the colonies as indentured servants, settlers, and immigrants. So for instance, in the 16th century, the loss of access to common lands forced many to migrate to here, contributing to the labor force needed for the colonial expansion. Historians note that this process was a major catalyst for populating English colonies like Virginia and New England, where displaced individuals could access land grants and work off passages. So colonization had become an outlet for the deportation of the urban underclass. During the first century of colonization, about more than 25% of the colonial population came from the ranks of the urban poor in England. So this leads to the next motivation, which was the indentured servants. So many of these Englishmen who were migrating to America, again, they were poverty stricken already, so they had no means. So they came over as indentured servants. It says about half of the early colonists that came to America were indentured servants, and they worked as contract farm laborers, domestic servants, and craftsmen. To earn their transport money, they agreed to work for 4 to 7 years. And according to some sources, the 7 years we usually reserve for those that had maybe a criminal background or a conviction. It was the longer of the contractual agreement. The fairly short of the 4 years in between was for those that didn't have the criminal background. And once they fulfilled their terms, they were often given money, tools, and the opportunity to buy their own land. So these indentured servants were fundamental to colonizing America, and comprised over half of the European immigrants to the 13 colonies, and it seemed to be particularly in the South. And they provided the critical workforce needed to build the colonial economy, agriculture, and infrastructure. And they had some other impacts on colonization or on the population. So it says that over 350,000 European migrants arrived under the indentured contract mechanism by 1775, and that they were the primary source of labor that helped solidify British rather than French or Spanish influence in North America. They helped to lay the economic foundation. The servants cleared land, they cultivated tobacco, and they built infrastructure essential for the economic survival of the colonies, again, like Virginia and Maryland. They did also begin kind of a shaping of the social structure. And while they provided labor, the system seemed to kind of mimic or reinforce almost like that English hierarchy where you have the concentrated wealth at the top and then you have the peasants at the bottom. So these indentured servants were still in that low strata. Also, interestingly enough, said it may have set up that transition to slavery. So you have the high turnover of servants, and with their eventual freedom, they left. And so that it transitioned toward the enslaved African labor, which also offered permanent, coerced, and free workforce. So these indentured servants may have kind of laid that groundwork a bit. But as the indentured servants completed their contracts, they got what they called freedom dues. And so many of them became landowners themselves, moved to the frontier, and increasing the population spread in the colonies and farther out west. One thing to note, the percentage of indentured servants steadily declined throughout the 1700s, especially after the American Revolution. And even some were able to shorten their indentured servitude by enlisting in the Revolutionary War, and thereby, if they survived the war, they were then free men. But then, so the practice did continue until at least the Civil War. The 13th Amendment that was passed in 1865 outlawed involuntary servitude, but of course, indentured servitude was voluntary contractual agreement between two consenting parties. And this was not completely abolished in the US until 1917. So that's our indentured service. Now, the last motivation that we will talk about is a word that you're going to have, it's primogeniture. I'm going to try and say that right every time. But in history, primogeniture was a legal system with a firstborn child, usually the eldest son, and it was a legal system. So they inherit the entire family estates, title or throne, preventing property fragmentation, maintaining that concentrated power of the elite and the larger land masses. This originating from the Latin for firstborn. It was common in feudal Europe and monarchies. Though variations existed, like daughters inheriting if those sons were present, and sometimes firstborn daughters, but I don't think that was very often. It was mostly the eldest male of the firstborn male. So this practice did shape social structures, again, by concentrating that wealth at the top. So how that affected the colonies was that because these eldest sons got the bulk or all of the inheritance, it left the younger sons kind of scrambling for what to do with themselves. So many of them in England, they would seek prestigious titles. They would like military officers, lawyers, government officials, clergymen, or professors. But then you had those that decided to come and seek their own fortunes here in America. And so they would immigrate, and then they would be funded, they would be educated, and a lot of times they were more risk takers. So they came and they ended up being the upper class elite here, owning those vast estates. So this primogeniture English system did accelerate colonization by forcing the landless younger sons to seek their fortunes here. And it seemed to also be more so, they would bring that primogeniture law here to the colonies in the beginning. And it seemed to be more so in the South than in the North. And so that English hierarchy seemed to carry over more down in our neck of the woods than North. So there were some impacts on colonization. Again, the incentivized migration. You have primarily that primogeniture that transferred into the southern, down in the South. And this kept the massive land holdings, just like in England. You'd have the elite at the top and the peasants at the bottom and the large land holdings and the smaller at the top. The impact on northern colonies was not as much. It was less strictly followed in New England, where the inheritance laws often divided land more equally, leading to smaller family-operated farms and a different social structure. But after the Revolutionary War, the push for equality was there. And within 15 years of the Revolutionary War, the whole system was abolished in all the states, and thus forcing a lot of those undivided loyalist estates and breaking up the aristocratic holdings. So that was the primogeniture. Again, it acted as a push factor, fueling the influx of these ambitious, land-hungry settlers that were kind of risk takers, seemed to be more in the southern colonies, and it helped to shape the economic and social landscape of early America. So those were three of the largest motivations for the colonization. Yes, Dan.
Just one little note, I'm not sure which period this was, but for a time, Britain would ship you for free to Canada to populate Canada. And so what a lot of people did, as soon as they hit Canadian soil, is they would make some sort of raft and float downstream to New York. And then they're Americans. So
Canada. That's funny. All right.
I have a question, man. In your beginning, you were talking about the 15th century, where there was population on the coastal area began to go up to a large amount. Didn't you really mean the 17th century?
Well, from what I had looked at, it said beginning in the 16th century and up through the 19th century, really, but the enclosure movement started in the 1500s, according to what I had seen in England. And Jeffrey, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was what I had seen. So,
Oh, you're talking about the closure movement. You're not talking about settling in America.
no, the enclosure movement in England, which then motivated the people to migrate here because they'd been kicked off their land.
Yeah, I got it. Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
Donna,
Yes.
you know, we associate the southern colonies with Anglicanism. That was the official state church in Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, and so on. Have you thought about the connection that would have with these social, economic issues that you cited? In other words, would the religion, the dominant religion in the South, have been a factor, perhaps?
I would think so, but you would have to elaborate on that. Because I don't think I'm capable.
Of course, you know, was traditional, had traditional English values, classical conservatism and all that sort of thing. So,
Okay.
you know, for those who are not part of the Church of England who come over, well, they're a little more open-minded and free-minded. And that would spill into, you know, economic and social values as well as religious.
Thank you, of course. All right, anybody else? Sure. Yes, ma'am. Yes, Brenda.
I've read that, the indentured servants, they would have this contract work so many years, and then many times they give them so many acres. And that worked real well because they wouldn't live through that, you know, all the harshness and conditions. But as they started to live through that and begin to get this land, that's what helped the transition to slavery.
Yes.
Because they didn't have to do that for them.
Right, so they had their free labor with the indentured servants, but then as they were, transitioning off, they needed more people. Exactly.
Indentured servitude, was there a transition from that to slavery? Like, at some point?
Okay. I think it wasn't a direct transition, but it seemed to kind of lay that groundwork for it, because they had basically free labor already, and as they transitioned out, they didn't have enough people coming in to work the plantations, so slaves were kind of a natural transition, unfortunately. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Alex,
moving right along, but explaining that there are 5 categories of motives for colonization from England over here in America. The reason we're putting them in these categories, I think, is to show the categories are a mixed bag, and so therefore are the people, and the mixed bag of people that develop, and the mixed bag of secular and Christian, as we've been pointing out. So Donna did a great job showing that there was a personal and economic motive. People personally wanted to try a better life, to take this opportunity. There was also, the second one is a national economic opportunity, and that would be England. And in a word, it was called mercantilism. And that was an economic theory whose goal was to make a nation rich and self-sufficient, measured tangibly in gold and silver reserves. This required something called a favorable balance of trade, which you'll see ends up really being favorable to the mother country, maybe not so much to the colonies. So the favorable balance of trade basically meant that the colonies would supply natural resources and raw materials to the mother country, to England, and England would take those raw materials and manufacture goods and then send them back and have a place to dump these goods and sell them in the colonies. Not a bad deal for England. The mother country got rich at the colonies' expense. The colonies also got some money, but we'll talk about that. Now, this favorable balance of trade was fortified by a series of legislation passed in the mid-1600s by Parliament. You may have heard of them, called the Navigation Acts. These acts were designed to benefit England and curtail competition from other countries, trading with other countries, mainly the Dutch, because at that time, the Dutch had much trade at sea happening. They kind of owned it, kind of consumed. Okay. So the first Navigation Act was in 1651, and it said that trade with the colonies could only happen aboard English ships. What do you think the purpose of that was?
Keep everybody else out.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a hassle to limit trading basically with the Dutch. I mean, with everybody else, but it was basically to limit the Dutch. A few years later, in 1660, the Navigation Act of 1660 forbade the colonies from now trading certain key exports to foreign countries. They included tobacco, rice, sugar, cotton, furs, and more. And so you can imagine the growing frustration and resentment in the colonies as England is making everything to England's benefit. And finally, the Navigation Act of 1663, now there were others, but these are the three I'm going through. They required all ships who wished to trade in the English colonies to go through English ports for inspection, repackaging, and of course, taxation. Right? The result was that the colonies grew frustrated and they got resentful, but they also got adept at smuggling, receiving smuggled goods, and the point of that was to avoid the import tax. In fact, Massachusetts in 1684 actually had its original charter revoked because they were breaking so many of these laws. So yes, all the trade did benefit the colonies, but more so England. So that was, so first personal gain, second national economic gain for England. Third reason, political. Some Englishmen were political dissidents, and they wanted to go to the colonies to escape consequences and harassment as they had scrapes and run-ins with the law. They sought political autonomy. They did not want rule by absolute monarchy. They wanted to cast off political constraints and the social hierarchies, classism that Jeffrey has talked about, of England. And England, in its turn, encouraged miscreants such as these to leave, including vagrants, convicts, debtors, as well as all kinds of religious, social, and political dissidents. The fourth reason is kind of the fun one, adventure. There were some men who were fortune seekers and visionaries who preferred the idea of a grand adventure, exploring America's untouched lands and interacting with wild savages. They preferred that. They preferred that notion to the settled, staid nature of England and Europe's civilized society. And some of these adventurers eventually became fur trappers and traders, and many intermarried with native women. And the fifth and final reason was the one we're probably most familiar with, and we've talked about it a lot. It's religious. This was the main factor, particularly early on. In fact, more colonies were founded for religious reasons than for economic ones. Different religious groups were seeking, as we've talked, to escape civic religion, sacralism, and break away from the tyranny of the Anglican Church and from persecution in some cases. And so, again, the five: personal opportunity, financial gain for England, political reasons, adventure, and religion.
Very good, thank you. So, how are we doing for time?
10 whole minutes.
No, very informative. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Religious, and then when you start to really think more deeply, it makes sense, all these other things going on in history.
So there's this mixture of motives. There's this wonderful cartoon I saw years ago, And it's two Puritans. They're on a ship bound for America, and they're talking, and one says to the other, yeah, I'm going to America for religious freedom, but I also want to start a very lucrative real estate business when I get there. So there were, mixed motives to say the least and all. So, well, thanks. Very, very, very good. So let's, in our copious amount of time remaining, let's just breeze through some of these other issues. Now, if you look on page 4 of the outline there, you see a general assessment, and many of these motives for colonization were kind of put together and popularized by an Anglican minister back then by the name of Richard Hakluyt. And Hakluyt had been had an active interest in colonizing North America as a means to extend England's power and influence. Now, keep in mind, England's always in competition with France and Spain and, economically and all, Holland and other countries as well. But in 1584, he laid the theoretical and theological foundation for the British Empire in a book that he wrote called A Discourse Concerning Western Planting, as in the planting of, colonies. And so Hakluyt's motives, as he articulated them in the book, relieve overpopulation and employ, quote, idle men. In other words, young men in England who were underemployed or unemployed, uneducated, unemployed, what they called at the time lusty youths. And so get them out of here. And here's this big continent nobody knew even existed a couple of centuries earlier. Let's send them over there. And the thought was that lusty youth would threaten the social order in England, which to some extent it did. Also, another motive would be to stimulate trade, as we heard, provide raw materials for England, as we heard, rather than rely on foreign nations, increase the Royal Navy, and provide overseas bases in the event of another war with Spain, enlarge the Queen's revenues, discover a Northwest Passage. What in the world was that?
How to get to the Pacific.
That's right. See, they did still, excuse me, still did not have any idea of how large North America was. They also had no idea how wide the Pacific Ocean was. And, when Christopher Columbus set sail earlier, he thought, now nobody back then, except the most ignorant people, thought that the world was flat. That everybody thought the world was round, basically, but they thought it was only about 60% as large as it actually is. So if the Earth is only 60%, the size that it actually is, then if you could work your way some way through North America into the Pacific Ocean, you could make it, conceivably, you can make it to Asia, Japan and China and so on. So discover a Northwest Passage. By the way, the St. Lawrence River, that seemed to be the Northwest Passage, but it was a dead end, like all the others turned out to be. And then also, though, Hakluyt really emphasized extending the Reformed religion. So true Christianity, Protestantism, he wanted, to extend into the American continent. And anyway, somebody who really kind of set forth a grand vision for how colonization could enrich England, which they all thought was the greatest nation and probably in world history, and also provide an outlet for people that weren't making it in English society. So on page 5, if you look there, the colonial potpourri, colonial society, very definitely a mixed bag, obviously. Some colonists were dissidents who had fundamental problems with English society, either religiously or politically. Many objected to English political and or religious institutions, for good reason, I might add. Others believed English society was too classist to say the least, and lacked economic and social opportunities. So the New World, and, you know, and all would provide opportunities. So you have dissidents. Now you also have debtors and various kinds of poor people who think, you know, life here in England is miserable. It can't be any worse, you know, in America. So you had dissidents, you had debtors, and you had dregs, the dregs of English society. Some were criminals, including felons. And in 1717, very important law was passed by the Parliament, allowing certain types of criminals to escape the gallows by immigrating to the colonies. So I'm sure they were well received with once they arrived, you know, in Massachusetts or Virginia or wherever. And in the 60 years between 1717 and 1776, you know, the founding of the American nation, England transported about 50,000 convicts, convicted felons, to the 13 colonies. So you have dissidents, you have debtors, you have the dregs of society. You also have solid middle-class professionals, artisans, craftsmen, farmers. Frankly, probably some of the best people in England. And some were among England's, as I said, their best, most industrious and talented people. Some were devout Christians who came to America primarily for religious liberty. And that, of course, can't be underemphasized either. So it's a colonial potpourri. You get all kinds of people from England and Europe in general. And they're coming to presumably the most free society on earth at the time. Although, as you know, in later years, the English would try to clamp down more in terms of trying to control the American colonists. And that's, you know, a major factor that led to the American Revolution. Right, and then let's finish in the 2 minutes we have here. On page 6 of your notes, America's early religious diversity. And what you have are basically three traditions. Colonial America was the most religiously diverse civilization on earth. Hard to imagine, because at the time of the American Revolution, I think there were only about 3 million people living in America. And yet, you know, I don't know what percent at that time were slaves, but nonetheless, religiously, we're the most diverse civilization in the world by the time of the American Revolution. Christians who came to America represent a variety of sects, but three basic traditions: Roman Catholic, but that was a tiny minority of no more than 2% at the time of the American Revolution. Mainline Protestants, which was the vast majority of Americans. Now, you know, whether they were true Christians or not, you know, varied from person to person, obviously. And then you have the Free Church or nonconformists who come. Now, these are people who do not identify with the Anglican Church, do not identify with the traditional Protestant faiths like Presbyterianism, Lutheranism, and the Congregational Church, which was basically a Reformed denomination founded primarily by Puritans. And then you also have Baptists. You have, again, quite a variety of other Christians who didn't feel welcomed or didn't feel comfortable in these other denominations. And so, again, a very rich, a very diverse religious population in America. And as I note there, although the process took generations to effect and there was much opposition along the way, by the time of the American Revolution, Americans generally had more religious freedom than any other people in the world. And so depending on what colony you settled in, you might be able to practice your faith, even though it was a small little minority faith like Baptists or Moravians or Quakers or Dunkers or whatever, or Methodists. The Methodist movement was just getting started as well. So these were great opportunities, unlike anything else in the world, including back in England itself. So America's early religious diversity. And we'll pick up at that point next week and talk about these religious groups that came over. I think you'll find it interesting. They all have their unique characteristics. And as educated Americans, we need to be aware of all of this religious diversity in our national heritage. I didn't realize till about 12 or 13 years ago, I decided to write a history of our family's tradition. And I'm the 12th generation. The original Brechures came over from France in the 1630s. And so I did as much research as possible. Actually, there had been an English professor out at San Diego State University whose last name was a variation on Brechures. And he had done a lot of research as well. It was fascinating doing all that research, trying to trace 12 generations, down to me. And I found out that in the third generation, one of my ancestors was actually Quaker. I would never have imagined that. And back then, of course, many Quakers were true Christians. Now, today, and this has been the case actually for a couple of hundred years, the Quaker or Friends, denomination is extremely liberal. And I remember we once visited the Quaker congregation in Decatur over near Agnes Scott College. And we sort of felt like we were probably in a Buddhist, gathering of some sort. It was not even remotely Christian, but that's been the tradition. There still are evangelical Quakers, but they're a tiny minority in Quakerism. So anyway, that was very interesting to find out that one of my ancestors was actually a Quaker. So anyway, we'll delve into that next week. And again, Allie and Donna, thank you very much for your contributions. And looking forward to moving on from here on. And so a lot to talk about. And we'll, for time's sake, we'll go through this outline that I sent out to you, just kind of point by point, fairly rapidly, like I've done in the last 10 or 15 minutes, so that we can cover more ground, because there's so much more that we want to cover in this course. And so thank you for your involvement, and good being with you all. Those of you joining us online in particular, thank you. And any questions you might have or comments, please don't hesitate. Send me an email, and I'll look forward to receiving those as well. So blessings on your week. Good being with you. Thank you.
Yeah. Your pagination of what you set out yesterday is totally different. Your pagination of what you set out yesterday is totally different from what you were saying. It's on page 6, on page 2. It's just like.
Thank you. Really?
Make it really well.